Our approach towards alignment in the design of reward systems has traditionally been very heavily based in the process of job evaluation, because job evaluation has been so central to the identification of what the hierarchy looks like in any particular organisation. Jobs have been regarded as the central organisational unit, and so we need to have some mechanism, some process, some policy in order to determine which job is least value in the organisation and which job is the most highly valued job within the organisation, and where do all of the other jobs fit in between that. So the design of job evaluation schemes has been a very important part of how we effectively design our structure, and so in turn how we effectively operationalize our approach towards the strategic alignment of reward within our organizations. So what things do we need to consider? What are the design choices? What different ways might we carry out job evaluation? Are there criteria for deciding that one approach is better than the other? These are the things that we need to consider. Before we get on to the various methodologies of job evaluation, a key consideration that we need to think about is just how many evaluation schemes or evaluation plans we might need. Now, this comes back to consideration of just how complex we think our organisation is, or how diverse we think our workforce might be. Now, if we think about a job evaluation system as being really a collection of criteria by which we judge the value of jobs, then the number of different job evaluation schemes that we might need to cover any one workforce depends upon whether we think that we can effectively differentiate between all of the jobs within a workforce by using just a single set of criteria, in which case we just need one plan or one scheme. But if we don't think that that will provide us with an effective means of differentiation, if we think that the jobs are too diverse to be able to be effectively captured just using a single set of criteria, then we need to think about having more than one job evaluation scheme, which in turn will imply that we will have more than one pay structure for our workforce, that not everybody will fit within the same pay structure, because a pay structure is just simply a reflection of how a set of criteria have been applied to a set of jobs. Now, that's a big strategic question, because we've talked previously about how the differences of where somebody ends up in a pay structure might represent a barrier to their cooperation with somebody in a different part of the structure. Now, what we're considering here is not that somebody might end up in a different part of the same structure, which is already a barrier, but is so different that they may be in an entirely different pay structure altogether. And potentially that represents an enormous barrier to cooperation. So if that's an important element for our organisation, we need to think very carefully before we go down the road of dividing up separate job evaluation plans, having different pay structures, and so on. There are competing pressures here on which way we go. The value of having separate structures is that we're able to more finely tune the criteria that we use to distinguish jobs from each other, so that we can get a more accurate, a more defensible, a less fudged response to the comparison of one job to another. But the disadvantage might be in the resulting divergence of the workforce and the split between a range of different pay structures. So that's our first big strategic decision on evaluation. how many evaluation plans should we actually have? The second big decision is about the methodologies that we employ. And there are various approaches that we might use. These are broadly split into what we call non-analytical methods and analytical methods. Now, these differences are not simply semantic. There is a substantial difference in terms of just how good these approaches are in practice, and more importantly, or at least as importantly, how good they're perceived to be by important external actors. Now, I've mentioned about how important the process of putting somebody into a certain place in the pay structure might be. Now, the fact that that's important should make us consider that it's also a potential source of conflict as well. And it may be that if we make a mistake or we can't properly defend where somebody is placed in a pay structure, that might be challenged, either internally through employment relations processes or even legally through employment tribunal processes. And tribunals typically tend to prefer analytical methodologies of job evaluation as the only ones that they accept as being legitimate and defensible. And so if we use non-analytical methods, which I will discuss so that we know about them, we may find ourselves vulnerable to challenge on the decisions that we reach, and that might lead us into some areas of potential disadvantage. So the two non-analytical approaches that we'll talk about are the ranking method and the classification methods. And the analytical approach is the so-called points rating scheme. And I'll talk about that one in a little bit more detail than the others because of its relative importance and how well it's regarded compared to the others. But just briefly, the ranking approach to job evaluation is simple. It's straightforward. It's a common sense approach, which is from an organisational point of view, management point of view, it's great strength. It's quick, it's easy, and it's very easy to kind of defend the principle behind it, even if it's not defensible in terms of its outcomes. And it works. There are two different versions of it broadly. The first one is called alternation ranking, and the second is called paired comparison ranking. Alternation ranking simply works like this. We take all of the jobs in the organisation and we look at them and we decide which is the lowest value job and which is the highest value job. And we put them at either end of the scale. And then we take what's left and we say, well, which is the lowest and which is the highest? And we do the same thing. And we carry on like that so that we end up having done lowest, highest, lowest, highest, lowest, highest. Consistently, we've gone through all of the jobs and the ones, and we end up with our hierarchy in that way. Now, of course, the problem with that is that it's done in a very common sense way. It doesn't look into the detail of the jobs. We just think, well, you know, in a kind of common sense way, which one looks more important than another, or than all of the others. It doesn't really break up the job and get into the detail of what that job entails. So it's subject to not providing a truly accurate reflection of the jobs and their relative importance. A slightly different methodology based on the same approach is the so-called paired comparison ranking method. And this approach, again, works on comparing whole jobs with each other. It's a non-analytical approach. That's how we define it. It doesn't break the job down, so it's non-analytical. But this time, all jobs are compared with all others. And each comparison, we put all the jobs on one side of a matrix and all of the jobs on the other side of the matrix. And where those cells of the matrix intersect, we decide, well, of that job compared to that other job, which is the higher value. And then when we've compared all of the jobs with all of the other jobs, then we count up how many favourable rankings did that job attract? And the job that has the highest number of favourable rankings, so it was compared favourably with more jobs than any other, will go to the top of the structure, and the job that attracted the fewest favourable rankings, favourable comparisons, will be ranked at the bottom of the structure, and everywhere else in between, depending upon the number of favourable comparisons that it attracted. The second non-analytical methodology is the classification approach. Now, this attempts to be a little bit more objective, in that rather than simply comparing one job with another in a kind of common sense way, the organisation will start by defining broad class descriptions, which it can then fit jobs to. And so those class descriptions will be indicative of a certain level within the hierarchy, and so if the job fits that description, then it will be at that point rather than at another point in the structure. Now, the problems with this kind of approach is that the definitions of these class descriptions can be quite difficult to achieve in a meaningful way, particularly if the range of jobs is quite broad. And you end up with these kinds of fudge situations where you have to define the class very broadly so that it makes some kind of sense, so you could see that that job relates to that description in any way, but in doing so it can kind of lose all meaning. It becomes too vague, and you enter into another whole problem of subjectivity, and well, you're just saying it's in that class because, you know, it's just a convenience, and it doesn't really mean anything. And again, it falls into the same problem of the ranking scheme, that it deals with whole jobs. It doesn't break the job down. It just, you know, basically stops at the job title, and then, you know, we're supposed to fill in the gaps from there. So the ranking and classification methods, two non-analytical approaches, benefits being very quick, very simple, very easy to understand, very easy to put in place, but lots of weaknesses in terms of their reliability. The points rating scheme is the analytical approach, and it's an analytical approach because, as opposed to the two approaches that we just talked about, it attempts to break down the jobs beyond the job title, to look at what is involved in that job. What are the various features of it? So it begins with job analysis, so that we can make sense of all the work that is done in the organisation. Now, often organisations have already done this because job analysis produces job descriptions. So if we already have a set of job descriptions in our organisation, we've already gone part of the way towards this. We know the range of work that's undertaken because they're described within the job descriptions. Now, the next step in a points rating scheme, once we know the work that's done, is that then we use that information to determine a range of what we call compensable factors. Now, compensable factors are going to be the criteria that we use to judge all of the jobs in the organisation. So we need to think very carefully about which factors to include. Now, the first thing is that it has to reflect the work that's actually done in the organisation. There's no point in having compensable factors that nobody does in the organisation. That's entirely pointless. So we use the job descriptions to identify a range of work that is undertaken in our organisation, but then we hone in and fine-tune them to identify the things that we think are most important, the things that are going to be acceptable criteria to all of the various stakeholders who are involved, to be those things that really differentiate jobs at one level in the workforce from jobs in another level in the organisation. We want the factors to represent a broad range of activities that are undertaken, so that they don't just pick up on certain types of work and ignore others. We need it to be broad enough so that everybody can have their work and the contribution of their jobs reflected in the scheme. So we tend to get very, kind of common factors such as skills, the effort required by the job, responsibility that's required by the job, the working conditions, very broad things often. And we tend to use relatively few factors. The fewer the better, in a way, because these are complex and time-consuming undertakings. If we've got a complex organisation, perhaps with dozens and dozens of different jobs, and we're looking very carefully at job description, matching them to compensable factors, we don't want to be having to match them to many, many compensable factors, because it's going to magnify, multiply the amount of work that's involved. So the fewer factors, the better. We actually think that if organisations only used the skill required by a job as their only compensable factor, then that would probably account for about 90% of the variance between all jobs in any scheme. And so we could really almost get away with just doing that. We tend to not do that because that probably wouldn't be politically acceptable. It wouldn't be acceptable to the organisation's stakeholders. People wouldn't see it as being illegitimate. There would be complaints that, well, that doesn't pick up the particular contribution of my work or the peculiarities of this job. And so we might add in additional things so that the scheme appears more acceptable, appears more inclusive. But we should try to aim for relatively few factors, and the fewer the better as far as operationalising the scheme is concerned. Once we've decided how many compensable factors and which factors they're going to be, we need to define those factors. We need to write it down. We need to articulate what that factor is. And we also need to scale it. Now, this is where we start to see the analytical nature of a points factor scheme, that we're not just using the factors as a kind of binary element. We're not saying you either have that thing or you don't. It's either 1 or 0. What we're saying is that for this kind of scheme, we can distinguish between a job that has a small element of this factor and a job that has a larger element of this factor. So we have a much more finely tuned appreciation of the value of the job against all of the factors that we choose to include. Now, just as we have decisions to make about how many factors we include, we also need to think about how big the scale should be. Now, like I say, we want to go beyond 1 and 0, so we want to go beyond 2 elements in the scale. But neither do we want to get where we have 1 to 20 as being our scale, because it becomes very difficult to justify why somebody might have been judged as having 17 against this factor rather than 16 on this factor. So we need to make a judgment about how big that scale should be, whether it should be a Likert scale, 5-point Likert scale, 7-point Likert scale, whatever it might be. But we do need to remember that for every point on that scale, we again need to have a definition. What does 0.2 on that scale for that factor mean? Can we articulate that in plain language so that when we judge somebody's job and we evaluate it and maybe they challenge it, that we are then able to go back through our process for the purposes of procedural justice and to be able to justify and defend how we identified their job at that position on that scale for that factor. The next decision that we need to make in the design of a points rating scheme is to weight the factors. So we decided how many factors we're going to have. We decided how big a scale each factor is going to have, but then we have to decide how important each factor is relative to the others. Now, this is where we might want to reflect upon the strategic importance of the different factors. And we're trying to direct people's behaviour towards strategically useful activities. So maybe the factors that are particularly relevant for the strategic objectives of the organisation, maybe they get weighted higher. We give them a stronger weighting in the scheme. And by that way, we we reflect a strategic intent. Now, when we then put this scheme into place, we judge each job against each factor. Each factor will provide a point score based upon which point in the scale that job was deemed to be appropriate for, multiplied by the weighting of the factor. And we do that for each factor that we put in place, and then we add all of the points together so that each job will have a total number of points available to it. Now, when we've done that for all of the jobs in the organisation, and you can understand now how that becomes quite an onerous administrative task, then the jobs with the highest number of points will be at the top of the structure, the jobs with the lowest number of points will be at the bottom of the structure, and everybody else will be wherever they fit in between. And that is a points rating job evaluation scheme.